Well, good afternoon. My name is Ryan Winkler, District 44B, Golden Valley, State House of Representatives. Before this legislative session began, Speaker Zellers said, quote, "If it doesn't have anything to do with business and jobs, it shouldn't be our first priority," end quote. That was on Minnesota Public Radio. But if we've learned anything this year, it is that Republican leaders have no power to keep their promises to Minnesota voters. Tea Party extremists, with the backing of outside interest groups like You Can Run But You Cannot Hide and Bradley Dean, Minnesota Majority, and other organizations, are actually the ones pulling the leadership strings in the Republican Party. From the very first day of this session, DFLers said, "Eat your vegetables before your dessert." We said the House rules should require that before you pass a constitutional amendment, you actually get your job done, which is to balance the state's budget. Yesterday, we saw just how far we are from being anywhere close to a budget agreement, with Republicans claiming that rearranging their all cuts and property tax budget is somehow an offer of compromise. They're not even close to the point of making a real compromise, yet alone being close to facing the reality of where they stand. Today, we take another walk down that path. With the regular session concluded, an anti-marriage discriminatory amendment put on the ballot, they come back during the summer and want to do another one. It wasn't enough to target one minority group. Now they want to go after the civil rights of others. Older women, students, the disabled, battered women are just a few of the groups who will be harmed by the constitutional amendment that Republicans are proposing today. I hope that if it passes at the legislature and it goes on the ballot, Minnesotans will have time to understand what photo ID actually does to our election system and how contrary photo ID is to the basic idea of access to the ballot for people who have a right to vote. All of you in this room know the back and forth on this photo ID question. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear to Minnesotans that Republicans are unable to enact a balanced budget into law, yet they are able to kowtow to the extremist base of their party. Minnesotans are not being well served, and it's time Republicans wake up and face the music.
Representative Winkler, polls show 75 to 80% of Minnesotans agree with this. How is that extremist?
The point is that the groups who are pushing photo ID are primarily Minnesota Majority, who have a whole gamut of extreme proposals in front of the public. And I will grant you that polls show broad support for the concept of a photo ID. I think the real question is, if people actually understand what that does to people's ability to vote, the burden that they're placing on seniors especially to vote, whether that broad support remains. And I guess by putting it on the ballot, they are going to require that Minnesotans get a lot more educated about this photo ID proposal, even though it has really no point, no purpose in our election system. We have a great election system. We have the best one in the country. We've been through 2 statewide recounts that show that it's the best in the country. Fritz Canuck, Norm Coleman's lawyer, said that they spent millions of dollars to find fraud in the voting system, and it wasn't there. It just wasn't there. So while the public might agree in concept that a photo ID is legitimate for voting, and I'm sure most people think, I have no problem showing a photo ID when I go up to vote, that doesn't mean that the proposal doesn't have a discriminatory impact and isn't motivated by an extremist agenda.
Would there be a way to do this that you might find acceptable, or is it just a bad idea, period?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that voting is a fundamental right. And any time that you want to do anything that's going to interfere with a fundamental right, you have to be very sure that there's a problem that you're going to solve and that the measure that you're passing in order to solve it actually will solve the problem. Now, so we've got a fundamental right. The problem that they're claiming is voter fraud. They're not, and they can't claim voter impersonation because there's no statistics for that. The only fraud that we know of is felons voting. Photo ID doesn't stop a felon from voting. We have measures in place now using the money that they're taking for photo ID to actually compare to corrections data so that we could find felons ahead of time. And so the whole problem that they're trying to solve doesn't exist. the measure that they have to solve the small problem that does exist doesn't align at all. And so what you basically have is a fundamental right being abridged for no purpose. So there's no way, unless they can discover information that would show we have a voter impersonation problem and this would solve it, that would be one thing. But and the burden's on them to bring the facts to show that. And until they do that, it's a bad idea.
No state has ever passed this as a constitutional amendment, and we've heard the arguments for months about the problems that you see with this as a bill. Do you see any specific problems with doing this in the process of a constitutional amendment?
Well, first of all, you're putting something, the language of the constitutional amendment basically says you have to have photo identification, and it has to have equal registration requirements for everybody. And when they passed the bill, they had no provision for absentee ballots. So the bill said basically absentee ballots wouldn't be subject to a photo ID because they were silent on it. If they passed the amendment, which says that all requirements have to be equal, that means a picture identification would be required for absentee ballots. And we pressed them very hard during the session, because there was a hearing on this amendment. We pressed them very hard to say, how are you going to deal with the issue of people voting absentee? How are they going to show a picture ID? And there was absolutely no answer. So one of the real problems with pursuing this as a constitutional amendment, in addition to the fact that you're putting basically a limitation on civil rights into the Constitution, but one of the real problems is that they haven't identified how in the world they're going to deal with absentee ballots. And it may just be creating a giant mess as a result.
Didn't one of the proposals have it so you could put your driver's license number onto the absentee sheet?
Sure, we have that now. But if the constitutional amendment passes, it says you have to show photo identification and the standards have to be equal for everyone. So if you have equal identification standards for everyone, that means if you're voting by absentee, you have to show an ID. And they might say, well, take a photocopy and get it notarized. But then you should be able to bring a notarized photocopy in when you register in person if the language of their amendment is to be taken seriously. And, I suspect what they did is they poll tested, or they took polling that has tested this language other places, figured out what was the most popular, the most likely to prevail, and stuck that in there, because they certainly didn't have any answers to the substance of the amendment when it was heard in committee.
I seem to recall earlier in the session there was, because one slight problem area was the felons voting. There was some legislation that was going through to further clarify, letting felons know that there are restrictions around that, and it seems to have gone down in committee. Do you recall that?
Well, there are two things. First, we've already passed on a bipartisan basis legislation requiring data to be matched between the Department of Corrections and the Secretary of State using Help America Vote Act funds. So that part is in place. The second proposal was to require notification of felons that they had lost their civil rights and that then they had regained them and had the right to vote. And my memory is that was either stripped out of the bill in committee or on the floor, but it certainly was not part of a bill that moved off the floor.
Wouldn't that be a solution to the alleged problem?
Data match and notification would certainly deal with the issue of felons voting. Photo ID doesn't, because a felon on parole can have a photo ID, so that doesn't help anything.
But there is a portion of the bill requiring people to check an ineligible voter list when people are registering on election day, which is supposed to address the felon voting issue.
If you use poll books with data that's up to date in the precinct place, you can do that. The way it works now is that it's done ahead of time with the registration rules checked against a database from the Department of Corrections. I mentioned before that they're taking money out of the Help America Vote Act account to fund the free photo IDs. The Help America Vote Act account is actually what's being used to fund the data match system. So they're undermining the program that we have in place that actually identifies those felons. But that's in the bill. I mean, your question is based on the bill. The constitutional amendment, remember, is kind of general language, and all of the legal provisions that would have to be enacting that constitutional amendment would have to be passed as separate bills again.
And couldn't Dayton veto those bills?
Well, if the public voted to amend the Constitution to put this language in the Constitution. The governor certainly would have a right to veto the bills and say basically what you're implementing the language in a way that doesn't work, or it's too costly, or it's too cumbersome on people to vote. He could do that. I think in the end it's incumbent on the legislature and the governor to enact a law that the public has voted on. But certainly there can be disagreements about how it's implemented. Anything else? Thank you.
Thanks.